to each and every one of you. Good afternoon, Nikos. It's a great pleasure to have received your invitation and the invitation on behalf of the whole party to hold this gathering here today in Athens, dealing with pivotal issues for our work in the European Parliament. This is work which is important for socialists and democrats everywhere. We are setting out the priorities for our political agenda at a key time for Greece. This is a time where we are very mindful of the possibilities for change in Greece. It may be feasible to have a progressive government installed, headed up by Nikos. And I'm very glad to be here today in this afternoon's session, in which we'll be dealing with a very important topic for European citizens. In other words, access to housing. We are very aware of the blatant problems that people have experienced in getting hold of dignified and affordable housing. This is particularly a pressing point for very vulnerable families. And of course, Putin is waging his war, and that has led to rampant inflation. That's made this topic even more of a priority for us as progressives and socialists. That's why we've come to Greece and have placed this issue on the agenda. The floor will go directly to Nikos so that he can give us his words of welcome and to introduce the guests who will take part in this round table. Nikos.
Well, this very tragic accident in Tembi took place last week, and it showed the weakness of the state, its inability to deal in an effective fashion for citizens, because the way that the country is managed, as the head of the country has said, as the Prime Minister said, well, it's quite clear that we need a different way to run the country. We need an alternative that will provide prospects to the generations of the future for equal, equitable development for all, protecting the environment, rule of law, democracy as well. So we spoke about energy poverty this morning. This is something that concerns all European societies. Then we had an opportunity to visit Melissa, which shows women, migrants, asylum seekers in their attempt to become part of Greek society and also to deal with their quotidian issues. That's what Melissa is doing. Now in this bureau meeting we have the opportunity to touch upon another issue that is ever so important for European society and Greek society. That is to say, social housing and cost of living. So social housing is a very major issue because it involves de-escalating the very, very acute situation as far as cost of living overall, and it will provide a secure first housing for the vulnerable in society. As you know, many of the red loans in Greece have ended up in the hands of people who have actually auctioned off their houses in the end. So I think it's very important right now to give the floor to the speakers, to the speakers we have with us here today, and with our speakers that are going to join us from elsewhere. I'll begin with Mr. Spirakos. Thank you very much. As you mentioned, the debt issue is very linked to inflation, as you mentioned. It is a huge problem because of the credit dimension as well, but for another reason as well. Greeks took these loans and took out credits in a period of great welfare, and then they had to pay back in a period where the situation had changed dramatically. These were conditions which were truly dramatic in nature, and under these conditions, PASOK responded, introducing new laws for undertakings which had confronted bankruptcy, and laws to protect the principal or first house or principal housing. It was very important for this to exist, to offer a second opportunity to homes, to households, to make a new financial start of a successful nature. This PASOK piece of legislation gave the opportunity to households to have some sort of place of refuge and to be able to protect their own first home. There were tens of thousands of citizens that benefited from this, and they saved the very, very minimum that is necessary for a dignified form of life. But this piece of legislation, which was a piece of legislation which has constituted a, if you like, social vested right in our society, it was annulled under the Syriza government. In 2019, this form of protection disappeared altogether, and the New Democracy Party has had to confront now the issue of the so-called red loans, made all the more acute by the loan and credit crisis, not so much because of something generated by households, but something generated by banks. What they wanted to do was they wanted to get rid of these red loans as quickly as possible, write them off from banks, and see what would happen with new individuals taking out credit. Anyway, we had no protection of the first home, as it is called, and we had liquidation thereafter of property. In the years that followed, particularly from 2016 onward, and from 2019 onward, all the more so, the red loans turned into funds. They were removed to the banks. They ended up in companies. 90 billion in these red loans are in a fund form. These funds, they don't care about their reputation. They don't have social responsibility. They're not part of the official economy. They're not registered there, and they are under no surveillance whatsoever. These individuals who had taken out credits were no longer confronting banks to pay back their loans, but they had to confront funds. And unfortunately, the treatment was shoddy. So these particular companies in charge of these funds are just there in order to reap as much as they can as far as profits. They're not interested in a long-term solution and regulation of household situations. Now, we have a different approach. These particular loans that became funds it wasn't a transfer of, it was a transfer in the relationship, if you like. In other words, it was no longer creditor and creditee, it was creditor and fund. And banks, because of the huge burden that all of this involved, were not able to manage this size of loans, and the transfer that took place to these funds in such a major fashion that these funds and the companies that took them over restructured all of these loans in a realistic fashion for those who took out loans. What we've seen today, however, is these funds are making much more than the amount that was initially invested. But it can't continue like this. This is unacceptable because the banking loan system is there to protect the national economy. What we want to do is for banks and for all those reaping profit to reap profit through productive use of loans. We can't have on that loan landscape, we can't have doubling and tripling of profits in a short period of time, all of that managed and manipulated by funds and companies. But we've entered into that particular field right now. These loans are not being managed by banks, which respond to the needs of citizens and the state. So the moment has come for major regulation to protect creditors, to protect those who took out loans. Protecting one's first home is the very minimum that ought to be there in order to have a good. Without protection of the principal home, we'll have an undermining of social cohesion and the creation of extreme situations. So we believe that at this point in time there's going to have to be a new type of bankruptcy law which will protect households, protect principal homes, protect undertakings in order to help them to adjust, so that we can give to those who have taken out loans the negotiating power to be able to deal with banks in a form of communication that will allow them to regulate and to adjust their loans. We need rules. We need rules of a binding fashion, which would require banks to conduct this readjustment in order to be able, in other words, to manage this entire loan situation. We need debt servicing which would be in harmony with the principles of a bank which serves citizens and the state as well. So we need responsible adjusting of the system as concerns loans overall. I do feel that there's going to have to be a radical change of mindset, restart on this particular issue in order to find realistic regulations that our citizens need. There are banks that, of course, carry out this social mission and this national mission which has to be carried out. But what we've seen, however, is that many banks have simply abandoned this mission. Not only do they deal with the issues of loans, but they have to deal with the turbulent times and the consequences that those times have for those who have taken out loans. Indeed, I do feel that the possibility has to be there for a realistic of credit and meeting responsibilities which they have towards their customers. Those are the core, if you like, strands that have to be there for protection of the principal home at this ever so critical moment in time, this period in which we find ourselves right now. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Spirakis. And now we'll give the floor to Mr. Kikilias remotely. Please, if possible, speak slowly and clearly. This will facilitate our understanding the message and will, of course, help our interpreters as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, dear friends. Sorry that there will be matters, but I have difficulty with your link. So, let me start with some basic facts about the housing problem of Greece. According to the National Statistical Agency, the cost of housing has become more expensive by 33% during the last year. Increases in student housing prices are up to 22%, while the available stock of student housing has decreased significantly by 25% compared to last year, especially in popular touristic cities. Those who are undoubtedly hit with particular severity are the vulnerable households and the young generation. Today, it is estimated that in Greece, 70% young people under 35 years old still live with their parents, and this is one of the highest percentages in Europe. Despite the reduction in employment statistics, 1 in 3 young people are unemployed, with poor prospects for finding a decent job, while almost 1/3 of private sector wage earners, that is almost 800,000 workers, work part-time with average around 200 people. According to Eurostat, before the intensification and the explosion of population, 1/3 of the population in Greece, that is 3 times the population, had to spend more than 40% of their disposable income on expenses related to housing. The situation is even more difficult for renters, as 80% needed to spend more than 40% of their disposable income on housing purchases. In the rest of Europe, this applies to 25% of renters. It is no surprise, therefore, that
recent research findings show that nearly half of renters are struggling or unable to pay their rent, and 2 out of 3 are cutting back spending on their basic needs. According to Eurostat, the purchasing value of wages in January 2023 was the 5th lowest in Europe. The same basket of basic food items requires in Greece almost 50% of the average wage, but 27% in Italy, 21% in Spain, 31% in Portugal, and 20% in France and Germany of the average salary. And according to another survey published a few days ago, 53% of households stated that their monthly income is sufficient for 18 days on average, 1/8, just a bit more than half of the month. So, stuck incomes, unemployment and underemployment that plagues young people in particular, the ever-increasing cost of living, especially in large urban centers, and skyrocketing rents make it prohibitive for young people to dream of an independent and dignified life. So let me now comment on a few things about the Recovery and Resilience Fund in Greece. One of the objectives of the RRF is to improve social cohesion and mitigate the social impact of the crisis. On average, member states have dedicated around 28% of RRF funds to support social objectives. The Greek government, however, has directed only 17%, 1/7, of total RRF spending to social expenditure, compared to the 28% of the European average. It is the 3rd lowest social budget at a time when the corresponding budgets in France, Luxembourg, or Malta reach 40% for O, and Portugal, for example, is the champion in this field with almost 44% of the RRF spending on social expenditure. Now, as far as the housing issue is concerned, in the Greek plan, the only housing program foreseen is a renovation program for 100 apartments, 70 in Athens and 13 in Thessaloniki, for a total of 250 beneficiaries. Portugal, in contrast, will use a far greater part of RRF to finance social policies, including affordable student accommodation and affordable social housing for thousands of families. Now, as far as our proposals, PASOK proposals are concerned, PASOK has set as its main political priority a coherent housing policy in 4 directions. The main axis of our proposal is the gradual creation of a public stock of social housing, which will not be available for ownership, as in the past, but for rent, constructed in partnership with the private sector. In its initial phase, our proposal concerns the construction of 20 to 30,000 new houses by a new public housing policy organization, which will be available at low rent to young couples and other vulnerable households. This policy measure is based on the successful practices from Portugal and the exceptional Vienna model in Austria. In the field of student housing, we promote in principle the possibility of universities that have available space to build decent and affordable student accommodation through partnerships with the private sector. The funds to finance these programs will come from the RRF, 1.5 billion euros available by the former Social Housing Agency and the European Investment Bank. Secondly, we are promoting the expansion of the rent subsidy program, including a repayment aid for housing loans to immediately address the increased housing costs based on income, social and property criteria, and taking into account total housing costs of households. Third, we provide incentives for homeowners to rent out their long-term vacant and unused properties, especially in big cities where the housing problem is most acute. These incentives mainly concern tax reliefs, but also the financing of the cost of renovation and energy upgrading, with the obligation to make them available for long-term rental at affordable prices. A similar program is being developed in Barcelona. Fourth, we promote an institutional framework with clear rules, limits, and restrictions for Airbnb-style short-term rentals, mainly for large urban centers, where there is more pressure on rental prices, as well as a stricter framework aimed at limiting opportunistic investments like Golden Visa. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Αγαπητέ Ηλία, θέλω να σου κάνω μια παρατήρηση που αφορά εσένα, αλλά πιο πολύ τους υπολείπους.
It would be good for Greeks here to speak Greek. We have remote, the interpretation will be able to be transmitted remotely, but those who are watching us remotely will not be able to understand the speakers if they speak in English. So please, it would be wonderful if our speakers could speak, if our Greek speakers could speak in English, in Greek, excuse me. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Kalophonos, from the representative of consumers organizations. So I'd like to wish all of you a wonderful afternoon, first of all. Indeed, we thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to be here. We feel that the problem is extremely important, that of housing in Greece. Now, we confront it from a slightly different point of view as a consumers organization, because many people confront the issue of high rents as a non-viable way to deal with their overall financial situation. In other words, what they try to do is stay as long as they can in their own home rather than go out and pay a rent. What happens in Greek society is that we have an increase in the price of houses, not only in regions which have been characterized as Airbnb, such as Airbnb regions around the Acropolis, or in lower income neighborhoods, For example, we have a tremendous increase in prices in the areas, in the lower income areas, because these areas have now turned into Airbnb areas, essentially. Entire apartment buildings have been demolished in order to build new forms of housing which are of a luxury nature. The purpose being to sell them in the southern suburbs of the city. So in the southern suburbs of the city, areas where the rent was 300 and 350 euro, now we have rents of 500 to 600 euro in these lower income areas. And this creates a totally intractable situation for the people that live in that area. Areas which were inhabited by students in the past. We have shrinking of those possibilities as well for students because there is no proper provision of funding to owners in order to deal with the tax measures that have been implemented. And something else which is quite frightening indeed and which ought to be submitted as a proposal is that there is no observatory. There's no observatory for renters. What that means is that one of the reasons why many homes are no longer put on the rental market because if one takes into consideration the taxation and also because of the 10-year crisis, many individuals renting apartments do so-called rent hopping. In other words, they go to one house, they stay for 1 year, then they go to another house, and what they try to do is avoid paying rent, essentially. The tenants have those renting have no way of collecting their rent. Nonetheless, they are subject to taxation for that rent. So it creates a totally intractable situation for homeowners. Furthermore, when we have these types of situations, in other words, somebody might come and stay for 1, 2, or 3 years, pay for a bit, but in the second cycle of renting, the owner rents it for much, much more in order to cover the damage, or losses from the increase in rents or from non-paid previous rents. So anyway, in these low-income neighborhoods, we see this phenomena rampantly. Now, from Mr. Spyrakos described the fund situation and the red loans very, very well. This is a drama indeed. Those who have taken out loans, they function, those particular funds function under conditions which are totally destructive and torturous indeed for those who have taken out loans. So there is a need to readjust this. You can't have a situation where these individuals who have taken out loans end up accumulating a huge financial burden. We can't have situations where an attempt is made to reap profits up on the shoulders of others. This is what we've seen. We've seen this with the situation on the housing market very, very clearly indeed. Now, funds have come out there and they have requested 100% of the nominal value. Secondly, they request a 10 to 20% down payment. In other words, if somebody cannot pay the 500 euro payment, then what they have to do is they request a 10,000 to 20,000 kind of down payment in order to regulate. This is an amount which is totally extortionary, which those taking out loans cannot pay. So funds will have to be required to make adjustments. Adjustment, I repeat, because many people who take out loans are subject to situations where there is where there are conditions that are totally unacceptable. And banks, of course, have been dealing or grappling with this situation as well. I hope I haven't confused you with this, but I'm basically trying to describe the situation, one in which simply those taking out loans and those renting, well, it's a totally unsustainable situation for them. Now, Mr. Pilates, the Vice President of INCA, will have the floor, take the floor. Good evening. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'll try to give you an image of the reality that prevails in our country as we see it from INCA, which is a consumer protection organization, one of the first in the country, with 53 years of experience. We're always next to the consumer, helping the consumer, dealing with the most important issues that they confront. Within the framework of the consumer movement, we have taken clear positions and adopted actions with regard to the protection of the principal home and to protect individuals taking out loans as well. We have participated in a number of decisions that have been taken by the General Secretariat for the Management of Private Debts, representing consumers and their interests as well. And from September of 2022, we have put together a pan-Hellenic network of consultants for households without any cost for the services rendered, always with the guarantee of the experience of INCA providing consulting services to people aided by lawyers dealing with situations where citizens are in debt. This has been put together with funding from the EU and involves not only consumers and citizens, it also involves businesses and professionals as well. The position of INCA is basically to readjust 3869 2010 legislation so that it covers not only individuals but also individuals who own undertakings. In other words, not only individuals, homeowners, but also those with undertakings as well. We would like for legal adjustment, just in nature, for all workers, for all pensioners. Because of the 2010 crisis, of course, their abilities have been considerably reduced. Reduction of amount yield have resulted in a 50% reduction in their wages. This has had terrible consequences for their lives because each individual, of course, planned their life on the basis of their pay. The consequences for their families, for health, their ability to purchasing power, and so forth. Of course, there was a fund provided by refunding of banks by governments. And in general, we do feel that bank debts have been covered to a considerable extent. But right now, we have the situation where there are debts that have not been covered, and houses are being confiscated and put up for auction. Now, because of the coronavirus and the consequences that it's had because of lockdown, in other words, our being closed up in our houses, and of course the closing down of many enterprises and undertakings. And we've seen the economic dire straits that has resulted because of reduction in wages and, of course, no enrichment of the public. We also have the consequences of the Ukraine-Russia situation, where in a number of different agricultural undertakings, we've had a totally catastrophic situation with huge losses because imports to major importers, particularly of fruits and dairy products, Russia, in other words, that market no longer exists. And the EU has boycotted the export of products of that nature to Russia from farmers who exported to that country regularly. Oranges, lemons, apples, melons, watermelons, strawberries, asparagus, kiwi, and so on and so forth. All of these producers were suffered because of this lack of this particular market, drop in prices as well. And the question comes to the forefront: Do people agree with these sanction decisions of the European Union? Are they aware of the consequences of these particular sanctions for Greek farmers? Many people have been led practically to the verge of suicide. They're unable to respond to the demands of the state and the banking system. We've had confiscation of property as well. And in addition, because of the aforesaid, one has to take into consideration the overall inflation that exists in the country in all sectors: energy, fuel, primary products, supermarket products, increase in rent, and so on and so forth. A state of law and welfare ought to protect citizens, providing for all of this, and we need protection. We can't create further victims under these circumstances. Thank you. Thank you very much. The floor now goes to Mr. Siafoutis from Epizon. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I've been invited from the Consumer Protection Organization, and at a theoretical level, as an attorney at law, I've been working on the issue of the red loans. Epizo and other similar such consumer organizations, from the very first years of the economic crisis in 2008-2009, have been on the forefront in the effort to deal with the issue of the red loans, representing the needs and demands of consumers and dealing with the issue of the red loans. So, having listened to our speakers with greater facility, I can enter into my intervention and say in a very brief fashion about what's going on in Greece. Greece is a debtor which is invited at this point to confront the issue of arrears. There are three roads. The first road is individual negotiation and services. The second road is involvement in a collective implement of an extra court settlement through a digital platform where, on a voluntary basis, banks and services and the public agencies also participate with greater commitments, the public sector than banks. The third path is the bankruptcy law that exists.
Unfortunately, none of these frameworks has been able to deal with the issue, not from the point of view of just unloading the NPLs in a technocratic way, but in order to protect the debtors. The negotiations are usually ineffective because the servicers and the banks propose unrealistic solutions. At the same time, the framework in which for the negotiation between servicers, banks, and the debtors, the so-called code of ethics for the banks, is first of all inadequate, and secondly, it is not supervised by any public authority. I will return to this point later. At the same time, the process of the extrajudiciary settlement with the use of the platform, electronic platform, has failed utterly and completely because in actual practice, neither the services nor the banks do not take part. They have the right not to participate, or whenever they participate, the solutions they propose are not realistic. They do not take into account the financial details. And the third case is the most serious one, is the bankruptcy code. This is the last resort for any debtor, and it is completely wrong because households are deemed to be the same as a company. we believe that a legal network that does not distinguish between private persons, households, and companies that have undertaken some risks is doomed to failure. Therefore, as is always the case in a bankruptcy process, with very few exceptions globally, the creditor is the indebted person is unable to save their home. The so-called Katselis law, the law 1318 of 2010, was protecting the primary residences in a balanced manner, as you heard from the previous speaker. This law is not in place, in force anymore. Now, coming to the regulatory and monitoring authorities, let me say that the national regulator, the Bank of Greece, has traditionally played a role protecting banks and not creditors, debtors. The Bank of Greece is mainly interested in dealing with the issue of NPLs in a technocratic manner, meaning the manner in which the banks will get rid of the NPLs, and is not concerned with protecting the debtors. Traditionally, the consumer protection authorities are understaffed and actually underfinanced. So they are unable to perform their monitoring role. It is just a directorate of a secretariat. Let me also add to this that in Greece we lack adequate data. Just because something without a microphone, but anyway, because of understaffing and lack of budget, we are unable to discover in Greece whether servicers and banks do comply with the legislation, which, as I said, is in any way is inadequate. So the consumer unions, which rely on their own resources and own budgets, are the only ones that can collect and process such data. But it is impossible for anyone to say whether the proposals of banks and services comply with the code of ethics that I mentioned earlier, and whether, on the basis of the data in each case, it is possible to submit a dignified and realistic proposal for the debtor. I don't want to take up any more of your time. I will answer your questions, if any. Our organization, ECPISO, and on this point I will agree with the previous speakers, believes that it is absolutely necessary to have a framework that will protect primary residences, which will deal with the problematic households as individuals who have seen their aspirations and their estimates toppled or failed, and not as companies. The previous legislation, which protected debtors, was not too favorable to the debtor. Debtors had to buy back their home, but in a dignified manner. It is painful for me to remember the negotiations with the Troika in 2015. That is when the abolition of the protection of primary residents started. I participated in 2 meetings, and I remember that the Troika representatives insisted that it is mandatory. 70% of the real estate that are linked to NPLs should be auctioned off, because there is no way we can imagine protection of primary homes. Although this is provided even in the United States. So it is obvious that there must and should exist a protection for primary households, and at the same time, compliance with the rules by banks and credit organizations should also be enforced. This is not the case, and the extrajudicial settlements should be promoted both for banks and for servicers. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this presentation. And now I will give the floor to our colleagues for comments, questions, or remarks. In our culture, both in Greece and in Cyprus, we are homeowners. But today, this is just an illusion. And the tragedy here is that it is not even possible for someone to rent a home. Younger generations suffer because they cannot cope. Imagine somebody earning 1,000 euro a month to be required to rent a small apartment, and the rent to be 1,200 euro. There are cries of despair from the younger people. We hear these things on a daily basis, and I would like to agree that public opinion, the public have borne a burden in order to save the banks, both in Greece and in Cyprus. Now it is time for societies to be saved. This should be our slogan, and this should be our focus. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Papadakis. Anybody else?
That have emphasis on tourism have maybe similar problems, because, for example, in my country, when you live at it's on. Maybe I should do it too. Like a double-decker. Is it better now? Is it okay now? Okay. As I wanted to say, in my country, there are lots of people who, every day, even more and more people who prefer to live not by working, by labor, but by renting. So that's why we, for example, as a political party, have a proposal on taxation of renting, because in the last 10 or 15 years, prices went so high that, for example, if you are a student in a seaside city, it's impossible to rent an apartment, because when summer comes or approaches, then nobody wants to have a student for, I don't know, a few hundred euros per month, but when they can rent the apartment per day, I don't know, maybe 100 euros. So it's really a huge problem, especially for young people. And as I see in Greece, young people are especially affected by this. European Union doesn't have competences on housing, but we have some other means of recommendations or help. We consider housing as a human right, like any other human right, and I hope that you know that we as a European Union and as a Parliament are determined to eradicate homelessness by 2030. this crisis, of course, makes things much more difficult. But I think with the right initiatives and sharing the good practices between all of us is the way to approach that goal as soon as possible and as successful as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Mohammed, floor.
I mean, this is, thank you very much, Nikos. Thank you all for coming here and sharing your knowledge and some of the solutions. But I mean, this is a very big problem, not only in this country, but in many other countries. And this will be one of the core elements, I think, for social democracy to make sure that we get the voters back. I mean, the fact that, you know, you cannot own a house, and if you own a house, you cannot pay the bills, it's a very big problem. I think one of the core causes is the lack of building these houses and the fact that investment or the return on investment for housing, especially in touristic areas, is increasing and increasing. And I mean, this is also creating inequality. If the wages are not increasing, but the return on capital is increasing, we call it, I mean, this is almost in every country. There's a big difference, a big gap between the two. I don't think this is fair. So at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we build more houses. I think the renovation wave of the European Commission and making sure that, you know, the houses become more isolated, we work on energy efficiency, could also be a way to trigger building of new houses. I mean, I believe this is a responsibility of the government, not only let the market decide what types of buildings they will build and who can rent them. Because as Dimitris clearly said, if you earn 1,000 euro, you cannot pay 1,200 euros for rent. This is a model that's not effective for anyone. So how we will solve it, we have to think about it. But that we need to find a solution and that the government should play a role and that, you know, housing should be a public task, I think we all agree on that. And let's see what we can do from the European Parliament to help member states to make sure that this problem will be solved. But at the same time, you know, if you have a government that doesn't care about, let's say, the low and middle income, then it's very problematic for us. I mean, we also need governments, we also need people to make sure that the governments make plans to build more houses. And I think as social democrats, I have a full trust in my party colleague Nikos, the leader, the president of PASOK here in Greece, to make sure that, you know, when we are back in the government, that we will give this issue the respect it needs and also the time it needs to make sure that, you know, the people have trust again, to make sure that they can find the house in the region that they grow up with, and that this does not go to big investors that get rented out to tourists. But it's a big problem, and I see it in many other countries as well. If people in the middle class cannot afford houses, then there will not be this transition, there will not be any movement, and basically the housing market will be on stop. These are my comments for now. Thank you, Nikos.
Thanks a lot. Of course, we have some instruments to funding social housing, as RFF. But in Greece, we don't use it so much. Only for 100 houses in Athens and in Thessaloniki. If we compare with Spain and Portuguese, it's peanuts.
Yeah, and we need to work with a different ideas and perspective. I think, first of all, sorry I had to interrupt my presence in the meeting because I had to attend another meeting by Zoom, but I could listen some of you, and of course, we can speak about the transversal policy in access to housing because we have different problems and realities in different countries. One thing is how difficult it is to access to the housing in some special places and cities where tourists, it's one of the biggest activity. We can see what happened in Athens or in Lisbon or in some places in my country, in Spain. Sometimes, for example, in Spain, we have an island where cannot have a doctor, for example, because doctors cannot pay or access to the housing. It's incredible, really. Doctors or other needs that has the island. No, this is very clear. And when we speak about the social housing, always we are thinking in the more vulnerable families. And of course, we as a social democrats needs to pay attention on it. But today, we are speaking that the problem is not only with the vulnerable families. We are speaking about the young people who want to create their families, and it's totally impossible to do that. Totally impossible. When I speak about the transversal perspective, we need to think in a short, in a medium, and in a long term. Why? Because there are other issues, like, for example, what is happening in the rural areas, because we have a lot of population in the cities, and we have a lot of houses without people in the rural areas. And we need to think on it, and we need to think that maybe we can invest more in these rural areas to guarantee that these rural areas have access to the education, health, culture, work, and maybe people can decide to live in these rural areas. Why the young people doesn't want to live in our rural areas? Because has not access to all these service. But if we pay attention on it, maybe this is another important issue. No? But in any case, we as a social democrats has to pay attention in the more vulnerable people, and think that the last crisis we decided to save the bank, and now we have to decide to save citizens. This is very important, and the access to the housing is one important issue. Yeah, maybe there are some questions from the public.
I can make one more comment. This is a phenomenon. I do not know whether we have it here in Greece as well. Due to the lack of housing, the house prices increase. And now we see that the rents, basically what the banks are asking, are increasing. So basically for the middle class, it's impossible to find a house. And if they can find a house, it's impossible to get the loans to finance the house, which is almost like a vicious circle, which means that we don't build more houses, because there's a lack of people that can afford to pay the houses, and we are going like that. I mean, in the Netherlands, we had this model in the past. We called it social housing, but not for renting, but for selling. So we built specifically social houses to sell, specifically to people with certain income groups, and we also tried to create the financing structure behind it. I mean, maybe this could be a model that we should try to at least develop and see whether it fits also in different member states. But we need the help of the banks. I mean, now to tackle inflation, banks are increasing the interest. And the same, I mean, in the Netherlands, I was looking, the same house, now it decreases in price because there was a lack of market. But the same house, although it decreased in price, is twice as expensive looking at the mortgage, just because the interest rate went from, let's say, 1% to 4%. And you know, we are trying to solve the problem on the one hand, and then when we try to solve it, the problem is then becoming worse due to another element. And I think banks need to take the responsibility there. People need to get access to finance if they have a healthy income. And I mean, at the end of the day, that's what we need also in an ecosystem, in a city. Rural areas are perfect, but then we need to connect them well. People are okay living in rural areas, but not if you don't have a good transport. Not if they're not well accessed by train, by roads. I mean, these elements all play a role. But again, as I said, what I see now is that due to the increase of the interest, also there, we see another problem in order to make sure that this problem maybe can be attacked, because you can build the houses, but nobody can pay the loan to finance them. And this is something we see all over the EU, not only in a couple of member states.
One more thing is that we need restrictions for Airbnb.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not expert and I'm not Portuguese, but our Portuguese government presented last week one plan to support the access to the housing, and they has to take decisions about, for example, this question, because in Lisbon it's totally impossible to rent or buy a house in Lisbon because everything is with Airbnb, and really it's important. This issue is now taking a different decision in different cities, because I don't know, in each country it's different, but for example in Spain this competence is in the local governments, but in any case could be necessary to work and to think in some guidelines at the European level to put some harmonization now in the different cities.
Εάν επιτρέπετε, θα έπρεπε ως σοσιαλιστές, θα μπορούσα να τα πω και στα... Ως σοσιαλιστές θα πρέπει να...
We have to help the European Union to make, to really facilitate the bolstering of social economy structures. I think indeed we need to have housing cooperatives of tenants, cooperatives of owners, and this could create conditions for development which would help banks as well. And we have to use funds, European Union funds, for financing these efforts. Now, for Greece, I would like to propose, if possible, as an initial measure, that there be limits set on the basis of the property tax. There's a property tax called ENFIA, which is a central government tax. It's a federal tax. It's not a local tax. And I think, indeed, there ought to be levels that would be set where that ENFIA or property tax would be taken into consideration. And I think it's important to understand that these tax funds reaped, that they ought to be able to be used by local authorities and not by the central government. I would like to comment on what you said, Mr. Kalofonos, that indeed we have to look at it in a different fashion on numerous different fronts. One of the key issues is just this. In Greece, where we have a high level of ownership, that's not the same in other countries in Europe. But that level of ownership has changed over the last couple of years, and the effect has been of a detrimental nature for the elderly and for young people as well, who want to have their entire lives ahead of them. So I think we need these kind of newfangled models that would take into consideration a different consumer culture, a different energy culture, a different relationship to community housing. And that's why we proposed that particular reservoir. That reservoir wouldn't be filled only with the building of new homes. Now, the Recovery and Resilience Fund here in Greece, it's a kind of lost game. If you see the amount that was earmarked here in Greece compared to other countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, well, it's a pittance here. The other issue is that here, that the existing housing, there are many existing housing which are simply closed, boarded up. We have figures from Thessaloniki where thousands of homes have been registered by the local authority of Mayor Boutaris, and the same applies in other metropolitan areas in Greece, where basically many homes are closed. We need tax incentives. We need a lower enfia, a lower property tax, in other words, and other incentives might be possible so that people would incorporate their homes, include them in that reservoir, committing them to that reservoir for 10 plus years, offering the possibility for them to be rented at lower income rates. I think that credit and loan system that's been promoted by the Mitsotakis government hasn't been effective. We're not trying to promote additional ownership. What we want is thousands of low-cost homes to be put onto the market, to be put out there. We have the financial situation, we have Airbnb, we have competition, which has resulted in a very difficult, in very difficult circumstances for tenants. So I think it's very important for us to look at the possibility of incorporating thousands of families into this new possibility, which has been proposed by PASOK. In other words, opening closed houses with incentives so that people would simply make their homes available for renting. I think this might be a possibility as well. Thank you. I would like, in reference to the problem of the red loans and the protection of the principal home, I'd like to underline and point out that in 2010, when we had the establishment in Greece of the principal home within the framework of bankruptcy law for natural persons, this was a very progressive law at the European level. We were the first country in the European Union that set up this system for the protection of the principal home and legislated upon that. So we had experience on this particular front, which I think in the course has leads us to believe that, well, in many countries we have adjustments in order to protect regulation to protect the principal home, and everything that comes out in bankruptcy law and the last directive for services makes mention of the need to protect the principal home. Why is this happening? It's based on a profound experience which over time we've accumulated, and that would be that if we don't protect the principal home, the main home, both bankruptcy law will collapse and fail because no consumer is ready to put everything he has in a suitcase and leave his house. So the consumer that will enter into or the family that will enter into that procedure will have to leave their home. That works as a kind of disincentive. It's dissuasive in nature. And there are studies of the European Union and of the World Bank where this particular issue is brought up. In other words, the protection of the principal home. It creates, there's a strong psychological link with the family, with the place of where one lives. If one is threatened by losing with the loss of their house and is invited to start from zero, that's not a second chance, that's not a second opportunity. So this maturity that we've acquired after 50 years of experience in bankruptcy law in numerous different countries, well, if we don't support true, just social conditions, well, people then will just slide into being overburdened by debt, and they will not be able to take advantage of any sort of second opportunity. They'll be completely snowed under. So what I do feel is that we have to protect those very basic minimum conditions for a dignified form of life, protecting the first home, the principal home, in other words. And that's why we mentioned about the extra out-of-court arbitration, the possibility of somebody who's taken out a loan to come and resolve any issues in that particular situation. In other words, to protect individuals, to protect them from being completely skinned and demoralized in the end. So I think it's very important. It's important to understand that today, the monitoring authorities, those monitoring the banking system as well, they place the burden of on the operation of the market. Well, this is sort of all right. It's important for markets to be able to operate effectively, properly, to have good banks. But in the course of this particular process, we don't have the rights of consumers represented to a sufficient extent. The right to protect households as well. There we see a lot of backsliding. And with the recent accident that took place in our country and the energy issues which have been on the forefront right now in our country, there's been a tendency to protect undertakings and companies and sort of push over the blame onto the vulnerable and the weak. Now, in PASOK, we've taken initiatives to upgrade to protect the needs, the rights of consumers, of tenants, of owners as well. But I do think what I'm trying to say is that maybe a different approach to these problems will help us to find solutions and will work effectively. I do feel that we ought not miss this opportunity. And what has changed, and we have more stimuli right now than we did in 2015, stimuli to protect the social state and the social network that keeps families and individuals afloat. Thank you.
Listen and know all these issues, and it could be necessary to put in common all of the different perspectives and ideas, to try to work in a common response at the European level, and of course, as you are working at the national level here in Greece, like PASOK is working. Thank you for your ideas. Thank you for this exchange. We will now to break this part of the meeting, and at 5:30 we will continue speaking about precarious employment and how can we improve this question. Thank you. sorry. The social dimension is a key priority for our political family, for the Social Democrats. During all term, during these difficult times, we insist a lot about how important is the social dimension in our public European agenda. We started working on it in different areas. We have to say that our commissioner in employment and social issues, it's important for us because he's pushing with us important issues like minimum salaries, minimum income, or platform workers. And now we are continue working on it after a social Porto Summit 1 year later to see how can we continue implementing all these issues. Really, when we speak about Europe and when we speak about the trust of the citizen in the European Union, it's essential to understand that the social dimension is a key issue for all of us, because if we cannot support the necessities or the problems for the young people or the precarious employment, it will be so difficult to understand that the European Union is acting in the right direction. And for us, for the Social Democrats, it's important to have the opportunity to meet with you, listen your ideas, your proposal, your worries, and please, if you feel or you think that we are doing some policies that we have to change, tell us, because it's important to know. And this type of meetings in the cities, in the countries, are essential to know if we are doing our work in a good direction. Nikos, maybe you want to continue introduction our guest now?
Καταρχάς θέλω να καλωσορίσω τον κύριο Γιάννη Σπουρδούλα. Μοκλούς. Τον κύριο Ντάς Καστιλιανό, την κυρία Λένα Χασιώτη, νέα δικηγόρο, και την κυρία Μαριζέτα Αντωνοπούλου. Να ξεκινήσουμε από τον κύριο... Ωραία. Να πω πρώτα εγώ δύο κουβέντες.
Introduce the topic, just a few words. Now, just to give you an idea of the landscape that exists right now in Greece, we are number 2 in Europe as far as youth unemployment, and first as far as unemployment for women. Today, 750,000 people are receiving less than 400 per month, because of shifts in the work landscape or because of part-time work, because of precarious situations as well. And unfortunately, the majority of jobs that are created are in this precarious realm. One job is split into two. According to the Commission's forecast, by 2024, the available income of Greeks will be 68% of the EU average, and by 2009 it was at 94% of the EU average. So that shows us this terrible backsliding that we've seen over these years following the memorandum. So with this real income situation right now, we are one of the poorest countries of United Europe. 25 on the list. We're just above Slovakia and Bulgaria. What we need is a new type of approach, caring for the family, the individual, and taking into consideration the demographic situation in the country. The policies of the New Democracy Party have made quite clear what their intention was with regard to labor rights. They got rid of the necessity to justify releasing of people, firing of individuals. They got rid of those various different protection measures, 2643 of 2010 and 4236 of 2011. And what we're speaking about here is the collective bargaining agreement possibilities. Those have been done away with, and 264 of 2000 and of 2018, that particular piece of legislation that was in place to protect laborers as well was simply struck off the books. I'll give the floor first to Mr. Skordoulas to tell us a little bit about the situation. Mr. Spourdalas, IT on remote working. My name is Yannis Spourdalas. I am a programmer and I'm in charge of a small group, and I'll speak to you about teleworking, and we will present our own personal experience in this realm. Just to go back in time, teleworking began, broadly speaking, with the pandemic. It was mostly in the IT sector that teleworking existed before the pandemic, and it was for some urgent instances. But the pandemic changed this particular approach and put us all into the teleworking world. And with that came a number of different challenges that had to be dealt with and confronted. The first column or pillar had to do with workers. Most workers didn't even have the infrastructure necessary to work in a teleworking regime. They had to buy laptops, they had to learn to work with screens, people were working with whatever they had at home and working at home. Most people don't have an extra office at home, so they'd be sitting on the couch, sitting in the kitchen. That was the place where people would work. That became their workplace. Major challenges, of course, for companies. Very few companies. Of course, IT companies were ready because of their nature, but others confronted major challenges as far as moving into that new digital realm to be able to support teleworking, and further challenges related to the culture and the structure of companies to be able to control and to see the working environment of their employee. Because if not able to see it, to understand it, it creates a problem along the entire labor chain, if you like. The first months were of an educational nature, wrought with anxiety, but I think in the course of things, a certain amount of a balance was to a certain extent achieved. Well, the pandemic came to an end, and then there were two types of people on the labor landscape. There were those that wanted to go back to the old way of working, and others that embraced this form of working from home, and it became part of their quotidian life, and they wanted to stick to it. So this new model of work was now part of the reality of the situation. It is neither negative nor positive. I personally prefer the hybrid form. That's what we're using at work, part of the days in the office and part of the days at home or wherever we want to be. Now, teleworking, however, showed us the need for change. As a worker, I'd say that there seem more positive elements in teleworking than negative elements. One positive thing, which is considerably important, is that the companies that I can work for, well, there's no longer that geographic restriction. I don't have to work in my region. I can work anywhere where the time zone permits for me to work. And something else positive, if, of course, this also may lead to certain negative issues. For example, overtime. Very difficult to monitor overtime at home. People there is that tendency to work much more at home. And also taking the possibility of people working from far afield, from another geographic area. This might lead into, if you like, dumping, of course. So this particular revolution can be used positively, and it can be used as a negative implement as well. It depends on to what extent we're ready to embrace it or to condemn it. So what I'd like to say as a key point here is that the world is changing. If our companies, if we ourselves as managers or workers aren't able to adjust to this new landscape, this new world, will it be in a state of perpetual conflict, if you like, or in a regime, in a situation which is not satisfactory or pleasant. Those are my two thoughts on this. Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Daskas Stylianos would like to take the floor. Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank the president of the party, Mr. Androulakis, giving us the opportunity to speak here. I'm from the private employee sectors, one of the largest unions in the country. I'm on the board of our organization. Now our private sector organizations represents workers that are very poorly paid for the most part, and in comparison to our colleagues in Europe, extremely poor paid. We do not get the benefits, the bonuses that the private sector colleagues get. We even have instances where certain amounts are requested as a kind of payback, if you like. In other words, employees are requested to pay back part of their salaries. We have no respect for labor rights, no respect for labor hours either. The very basic, the very most fundamental rights are not respected in our sector. We are frequently the victims of bullying and mobbing. The minimum working hours in our particular sector is approximately 12 hours, and we don't have the necessary very fundamental conditions, work conditions that are demanded by the General Confederation of Labor Unions in Greece. We frequently do not receive even the minimum wage. We have undercutting of the wage. We don't have proper training for our workers for us to be able to compete at any level, essentially, at the confederation level and at the federation level. We've been trying to exert pressure so that our problems would be confronted on a daily basis. I've been working for a company for 17 years, and when I had changed 17 years, and when I changed companies, I lost all of the accumulated rights, and those are vested rights, I would like to mention, that I had accumulated over those 17 years working for another company. So what we see essentially is no implementation of the very fundamental labor rights and skimpy labor rights, I might say, that already exist. I think it's important for us to lodge our complaints and for our issues to be heard by you, esteemed members of the European Parliament. Thank you very much, Madam Lena Chasiotti, not Chaniotti as it's written in the program, will take the floor at this point. Thank you very much.
Dear representatives of the S&D Group, dear President, dear comrades, let me also welcome you to this country. The fact is that your arrival to Greece coincides with a tragic event. It is something that has shocked this country. The only thing that we are seeking from now on will be for the judiciary to investigate the matter in depth. Still, from my position, I would like to focus on the profession of a lawyer. I am a lawyer myself. This is a profession that serves justice. I would like to focus on the problems that arise in the professional life of a young lawyer. As we all know, a young lawyer is a person who is assigned the defense of the parties. That is, the persons who try to resolve their problems either in the judiciary or outside the judiciary. This requires, before the hearing starts, a number of processes need to be completed, such as preparation of the files, preparation of the defense, and also any other preparation in order to support our clients in the best possible manner. But things are not as easy as one might think for a young lawyer. If not in every case, but certainly in the majority of cases, a young lawyer who decides to work as an independent professional starts working as an independent professional, but at the same time is unable to pay for their own premises. So the usual thing is for them to have their office alongside the office of an older colleague and provide services to them as well. So a young independent professional lawyer is required to provide services without working hours or even working days. Therefore, we all understand that the daily work day can be long and very demanding. As an independent professional, this person does not enjoy the benefits of a salaried lawyer and the protection of a contract, and therefore they are not entitled to specific holidays or other advantages such as Christmas and Easter bonuses and many others. Moreover, a lawyer is not paid for their extra time that they work in order to deal with such a demanding job. There is no legislation providing some financial security in case the older lawyer decides to interrupt their working relationship. What happens after that is up to the employer's discretion. Moreover, in this profession where men prevail, women are not entitled to pregnancy leaves, only the one that the Public Employment Agency has provided. Moreover, we are also requested to contribute our very high social security contributions, and which are disproportionately high compared to our fees. Therefore, it is obvious to all that being a lawyer, and especially a young lawyer, has many difficulties. We believe that young lawyers have not been supported by the state, although for the past 2 years we had to survive without trials. The courtrooms were closed and with zero income. Therefore, all the lawyers, and especially the newcomers, would like to see a foundation that would actually protect young lawyers and allow them to follow a good career. Social security contributions should be linked to our fees or our salaries. As you know, dear comrades, I'm sure that the role of a lawyer is critical for the country and society. But we need to provide possibilities for young lawyers to work, act, and claim better working conditions. The presence of our Bar Association needs to be strong, and the efforts of all our colleagues for better working conditions and equal opportunities must be permanent. And I believe that all of us here are in favor of us because of that, because we are all in favor of progress and change. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Hasiotti. And before I give the floor to Ms. Antonopoulou, who is the Deputy Labour Secretary of PASOK, I must say, in order to boast a little bit, that we have undertaken a new legislative initiative regarding the pregnancy bonus or leave for women who are independent professionals.
I too would like to thank the President, and I'd like to welcome Socialists and Democrats to our country. We all hope for better times, and we fight for better times. I have learned to speak about working and labor conditions in Greece, unfortunately under dark skies, and the skies have become even darker, but I'm used to it now. Greece has been of great concern over the last 15 years for the European Union with all the terrible economic situations we have had, and because of the deteriorating labor situation as well. There are three issues that I'd like to focus on in the course of my presentation. First of all, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the reality on the Greek labor market for young people, what this means from a sociological point of view, and there I'd like to speak to you about the economy, to have a kind of integrated approach to dealing with the problem as socialists. Now, also with regard to according to precarious situations, well, I'd say that it's better to focus on the 25 to 35 year-old age group. We have very, very precarious conditions that prevail when compared to other countries. The present-day precarious situation of young people is, as mentioned by my colleague before me, is made up of individuals that are from an area, low-income jobs which lack flexibility without stability, and as mentioned by Madam Chasiotti, very, very highly skilled professionals who are remunerated with very poor conditions, very low amounts in other words, and they live in a situation of perpetual precariousness as well. Young people and women are the most vulnerable throughout the labor market in Greece. The high levels of unemployment, 27% above the general unemployment rate is the unemployment rate for young people in Greece. It's about 10.5% overall, and among young people it's 31 to 37%. We're speaking about also a large group of people that receive less than 400 euro per month, less than 450 euro per month. And then another large group which receives up to 710 euro per month. So very, very low wages indeed. These are wages prior to taxation. So what's left in your pocket is a lot less than that. And there's also a lot of non-registered labor that's taking place. People who are working X number of hours, but in reality are working much more than that, but are remunerated according to that official amount that they supposedly work. Here we have approximately a 54% figure that represents, in other words, 54% of the working population. A very classic model which is characteristic among young people, particularly those working on platforms, in large undertakings, and in the tourism sector as well. But the same happens with young scientists and professionals as well. I worked in that particular fashion, in other words, with a little receipt book, as it's called in Greece, and a low wage. I worked under those conditions for 16 years. That leads to a high level of self-employment, which is approximately 25% in Greece, and that goes along with precariousness, and that involves also lower skilled jobs and higher skilled jobs as well, much higher than elsewhere in Europe. Precariousness also involves certain agreements, which are limited time contracts, tourism season contracts, and so forth. The many young people live below the poverty level. Now, so our country is also a country which is bleeding workers. In other words, many people are leaving the country, particularly young people. We also are recipients of people leaving from other countries, particularly from Bulgaria and from Romania. This, of course, creates problems as far as cohesion, social cohesion of young people, and as a result also affects democracy in the country. After 10 years of the Commission-imposed memorandum, we have a chipping away at flexibility, at collective bargaining capabilities, a total fragmentation of the labor market, and also a chipping away at very fundamental labor rights. We have people that have fallen into this cycle of having a precarious job, then no job, then a precarious job, then no job. These people cannot enjoy any social bonuses or any sort of subsidies provided either. These are people who are locked in a terrible, vicious cycle of precariousness and uncertainty. The third point I'd like to mention is that, well, why does all of this happen? Why is Greece in such a dire situation? We feel that the problems, and I'd like to refer to the General Confederation of Labor Unions, the study that we've conducted focuses the problem, or has determined that the problem is on the labor structure that exists in the country. Health, law, digital technology, social sciences, where I am, we've seen a certain amount of improvement in these particular sectors as far as the structure of the labor market, but other sectors are in terrible condition overall. The structure element is a result of the fact that it's not its intensity of work and not intensity of knowledge or of skills that counts. Our economy is one which is a very fragile one, with many SMEs, micro enterprises as well, very inward-looking as well, with huge chasms between the different labor categories as well, huge chasms between the level of training and education. On top of that, we have the brain drain and brain waste. That is 33.3%. Really one of the worst in Europe. So workers so graduates are working in jobs which do not correspond to their training and to their skills. Greece has the third position in Europe of the 28, and as far as brain waste goes. In other words, people not being able to use the skills, training, and knowledge that they have, working in jobs for which they are overqualified. We have many highly skilled individuals that don't find jobs, and then we have those highly skilled same young people. They don't have where to work because they don't have the necessary skills which are demanded, for which there's a demand on the Greek labor market. Now, this structural problem in Greece was very well illustrated last year by a huge evaporation, if one could say, on the labor market. Many people simply abandoned the labor market, particularly in the tourism sector, where we had a huge deficit because of total dissatisfaction on the part of people in that sector who simply abandoned their jobs. So we have serious fundamental problems as far as the structure of the labor market. How are we going to emerge from that? How are we going to emerge from the remnants of the 10 to 15-year crisis that totally chipped away at the labor market? How can we create a new culture? How can we create new examples that might serve for the future? These are all questions which are extremely important. It's important to carve new paths, find new ways, create a new labor structure, draw young people to energy, the sciences, to the new digital spheres that have emerged on the labor market. We need a change in culture. A kind of quantum shift has to take place for people to be able to use the skills that they have, the knowledge that they have. And we do feel that returning to those very fundamentals of collective bargaining are absolutely imperative. Without those, it is impossible to move forward effective. And let's not fool ourselves, however. Young people it's been 10 to 15 years since young people have had the opportunity to meet together within some sort of structure and discuss and demand and call for the changes to take place so that this whole landscape can undergo major reform. Thank you very much.
Any of the colleagues who would like to take the floor?
La compañera estaba describiendo una realidad que es verdad que tiene elementos muy comunes en distintos países de la Unión Europea, pero que también están poniéndose en práctica fórmulas.
Nonetheless, she was putting forward a number of solutions there, and it's important we share these solutions. The reality of this precarious labour market, as you were sketching it out, we could also take as an example of that what's happening in my country, Spain, and this has been going on for some years. In Spain, last year, we enacted a labour reform which really homed in on streamlining the great number of different contracts. There was almost one different contract for each very specific kind of job. So this was greatly whittled down. And that's what even the European Commission has been clamouring for some while. The Commission wants us to overhaul our labour market. The initial response from business owners to this labour reform, well, they said it would erode the labour market and that therefore this ought not to be enacted. As things stand in Spain, jobs are being generated. We are seeing more stable, better quality jobs being brought into being. Of course, we need to do more work on the minimum wage. Over the past 18 months, there have been 2 hikes in the minimum wage, from €780 to €1,080. That's been the increase in about 14 months, so headway is being made. That said, what you were describing there is hyper-qualification of young people, and this ties in with the need to tackle changes in our education model, particularly when it comes to vocational training. What we ought to be doing is to examine vocational training and bring it into line with the new challenges and emerging factors such as renewables and digitalization. We are having to enact a swathe of initiatives here, and we lack the necessary experts. Recently, I visited a training centre in the countryside, and I was told, look, for 10 years we've been holding hairdressing courses, administration courses, and bricklaying courses. And we were told there were no longer hair salons or offices for administrators to work in. And the same is true of installing solar panels. So we really have to bring the training courses into line with what the job market wants. Also, when it comes to work in the tourist sector, well, that sector has its peculiarities. I mean, we've seen what happened last summer, this summer in Greece and indeed other countries, particularly in the south of Europe, where there is a very developed tourist industry. In the wake of the C-19 pandemic, all of a sudden, people started to travel and there was a hike in demand. But companies can't find the right young people to do the work. It's not that the young people don't want to work, they just don't want to work under the current conditions. They're having to work for more than 14 hours, whereas the actual contract says, say, 5 hours. Maybe these young people are being paid under the counter for this overtime, but that's not stipulated in the contract. This just goes to show that citizens, workers, and particularly young workers, are more and more demanding, and they have to fall into line with what is being asked of them. The business owner may be raking it in, but this is not trickle down to the actual workers, so a lot of awareness raising needs to be done there. Pedro, did you want the floor? And then Gabi.
Really glad to be here, and Nikos, a particular word for you. Thank you for organizing, for hosting us. It's great being here, and what I will do exactly from the beginning is bringing the experience even of my country, as Irache just did with Spain. It's, I mean, the kind of situations in which our countries are, these countries from Southern Europe, in a sense, are we can see a lot of similarities. Why do we see them? Of course, because a good part of the basis of our economies are also similar. Very strong tourism sector, also lagging behind the rest of Europe for many years. In our case, because of the dictatorship, we were lagging half a century behind the rest of Europe in terms of education and training. And so, and even, as you well know, and it was not the case of Spain, because there the government fought against the external program of the EU and of the ECB and of the IMF. In our countries, we tried to fight, but in the end it was completely impossible because a coalition was created against that fight. And so we had, as Greece had, this external program of what we called in Portugal the Troika. And the program was indeed a lot of suffering for our country, for our citizens, for our workers, for our youngsters. That was what it meant in the end. But fortunately, after the program, we managed to turn the page of austerity. And that was the big difference with Greece. Here, the government, for years now, insists in the same kind of therapy that the Troika brought to our countries. The ideology is the same. As it was the case of my government in my country, where when the Troika was there, the ideology was the same. They were even trying to double down on the program of the Troika. The result for us was much more deficit, much more debt in that period, and a huge destruction of jobs and of hope for people in general and for the youngsters in particular. Finally, we managed to get rid of that, as we hope soon it will also be the case here in Greece. But unfortunately, for a number of years, it was a really suffering for my country as well. When Antonio Costa arrived, and Nikos was there just recently, about a year ago or something, unfortunately COVID didn't allow me to be there with them, but I was really glad that Nikos was working with the Portuguese government, was looking at that experience with his team, because the first thing we did when we got to the government was really turning the page of austerity. And we said to Brussels, this will not work, this is not working. And so we managed to put a strong education priority into our policies, a strong move towards the digital economy, and a strong social program to help the families that were suffering more from the crisis. And as Iracha just said, we also increased significantly our minimum wage, almost 50% from the beginning of the government to this period of this legislature, and we are creating jobs to a record standard in my country. So it is a lie that raising the minimum salary will destroy jobs. In our case, it was exactly the contrary, as it was, by the way, in Spain. It's the same experience we have. Of course, it has to come with education, with training, with getting to attract new jobs, but we have done it, and that example we can bring to your economy and to Greece as well. We also did, as Spain did, a very important program, Nikos, through the legislation, on fighting this precariousness, this informal economy, and really helping the youngsters to have a sense of hope when they arrive to the labor market. I mean, in my country, up until recently, just for the fact that you were a youngster coming to look for your first job, it was immediately a condition that would allow the employer to give you a short-term contract. And that doesn't make any sense. There are conditions in which you should have a short-term contract, and those should be applied, but not just because you are looking for your first job. It simply doesn't make sense. These traineeships, no payment on the traineeships, total precariousness. I mean, we have been changing and changing that, and we have still created a lot of jobs in Portugal at the same time that we are providing more stability at the labor market. So this really can be done. You have the examples of governments from your political family, Nikos, that you can bring to the citizens in Greece. It can be done. We are doing it in the Iberian Peninsula together. And so, I mean, these are countries with the same kind of situation you have, and this is the example I wanted to bring. And I also would like to ask you, being responsibles in the labor unions, in the trade unions, in the labor market here, what is the capacity of the trade unions at this moment to represent these new workers, these workers of the new economy? Because this is a huge challenge in the rest of Europe. I'm sure Gabi is also an expert on this matter. She might come back to it. I mean, we have just discussed it with DTUC just at a group meeting 2 days ago. This is a huge challenge for us to be able, for the trade unions to continue to represent these workers from the new economy. It's a huge, huge challenge. But I would like to ask you about that, and also, Nikos, to you, on the digital literacy of the population, because this is a huge issue. The ones that stay out of this new economy are the ones that, I mean, are not capable to be in the digital economy. What's the situation here? Was it a priority to this government to include the citizens in terms of the digital economy, or is this also a challenge for a future government in this country? I mean, of course, I cannot conclude without a word about the disaster that happened here. I am appalled by the situation. I was a minister for infrastructure in my country, so unfortunately I know quite well about some of those technological reasons and technological elements that are not yet in the systems here in Greece, but of course it's a huge tragedy, and I want to be, of course, in full solidarity with you as representatives of the Greek people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your overviews. I'm tempted to do one general comment before I go into the question, especially of youth employment and youth unemployment. And when I listened to the reports, how very often the situation is in terms of working time, working conditions, etc. In my brain, I was just always saying, okay, this is a breach of the working time directive. This is a breach that we have on the directive of that everyone has a written contract and the right, etc. So the question of compliance with EU law, I think this is something we have to set back on the agenda. It is, and in former times, the Commission played a much stronger role here to look into the member states and see how the rate of compliance is. and we can see that it is very different and that it is against EU law in many areas what happens here. But that was just a general comment, and I think also to us in the S&D group, we have to take back this issue, because otherwise you can do the best legislation if it's not really, if they don't comply, the member states, and not fully implemented, it doesn't bring anything. But I would like to come back, and when I listened, I was thinking, really, because my key issues are social policy and democracy. Why would young people vote for any party in Greece? Why should they do it? I mean, it's really a key question I was asking myself. Because the problems, and it was said, a lot of these problems are very structural problems. And we, from European level, we have the year of youth, we have the youth guarantee. It's more symbolic policies. They are like a band-aid. They help a little bit to soften things, but they don't go onto the structural problems. And I think the positive news might be that I think we are entering a new stage in Europe, and that is that in all member states we have a huge skills shortage. And in former times it worked that the more well-off countries then attracted others from other member states, and it leveled, but now we have it in all member states. And we know that we cannot also, if you look at the demographic situation, and that's the interesting thing, if you look at the member states where you don't have good perspectives for young people, and you look at the demographics, it is quite obvious. If you don't have a certain level of security, of optimism, of hope to build a future, this has an impact how people do their lives. So I think to have a coherent approach how to act here is essential. But I think really, if you look at what do people want from their life, they want a quality job, they want a good pay for it, and they want also a social security. And I think here, young people do not differ from old people and old not from young, but what we can see that young people in some countries of the EU are excluded. Neither they have quality work very often, nor they have pay, or not to talk even about sufficient pay, or social security, as we heard. But I think to address this, and if we look, I think it's also an issue we have to think for the next term, is I think it is a shame that we allow time-limited contracts in general. Because in the generation before us, the normal thing was you did an apprenticeship or you studied. You had to find a job. That was often this first transition from education to finding a job was hard. But then people would find unlimited contracts. That was the normality. Now the normality for young people in many member states is, I mean, to find an unlimited, well-paid contract is almost like winning in the lottery. And this is something also we can address here, and we should address, and to see really this question of the skills gap. How we address this. One solution could be we just again drag in some workers from other countries that are willing to do it for less pay, or if we really address the structural deficits here, and I think what you said with the digital transformation is also a huge opportunity for young people, because what we are trying, Pedro and Mark and we all, what we are trying is to make sure that the work of the future is also, that gives new opportunities also to telework, but we need rules for this. We need good rules for this. It gives opportunities, It has challenges, but we also don't want workers tracked through digital tools, totally monitored. All of this we want to do, but we have to make sure that this work of the future is really also a work where you find good contracts, where you are protected, and also we always say in the digital work the same rules that we have apply then in the different world, but it doesn't seem in the reality to be the case. So to see the opportunities here, but also I'm thinking, and this is my question to you, is there a kind also of youth movement, or are people just frustrated because it takes already it is happening for such a long time? And how to mobilize here to make sure if I would be young, only vote for a party that in reality provides opportunity for young people. Thank you.
Ξέρω ότι δεν ήθιστε να δευτερολογούμε, δεν το έχω ξανακάνει, αλλά νομίζω ότι αντιμετωπίζουμε
But I think we're confronting labor. What we ought to understand, first of all, that labor is the consequence of a change. So without looking at the entire change, we can't look at labor on its own. Labor is the result of our studies, our training, our entry into the labor market, independent of where we're from, is the consequence, the result, if you like, of this entire effort. So I'm of the feeling that we are outdated. We're not updated. We're out of date. We're archaic, and we're trying to solve a problem that we see the end of without looking at the entire trajectory. So for us to look at the trajectory, we have to conduct a targeted, if you like, approach is necessary that would go back 20 years. Education doesn't take place in a single year. So if we're trying to find a solution to the problem that exists, the solutions might be in the end very superficial, and perhaps we have to look at things in a much more profound fashion if we want to have proper results. Of course, every country has its own idiosyncrasies. The legal framework here may be much more complicated than elsewhere, and we may find some sort of relief in changing the framework, some sort of relief. But if we really do want to solve the problem, create greater jobs, which are not precarious, which are safe, which are sustainable, I think we would have to follow Europe. Europe means breadth and vision. And we'd have to... otherwise, we're simply looking at the little piece that we have right in front of us right now. I think perhaps if we broaden our Europeanness and look at things, try to solve the problem by looking over time and not try to just provide some sort of relief, temporary relief, looking at this particular moment. A brief intervention on my part to give you an integrated presentation of the problem that exists beyond the numbers. In Greece, there are two issues which are related to what we're talking about right now. First of all, the rules on the market, on the labor market, is one issue, and the other issue is the quality of work. Let me begin with the second of the two. The quality of jobs has to do with the quality of competitiveness and of development in the country. Unfortunately, the years of the financial crisis, the economic crisis, where Greece ended up being able to stand on its 2 feet financially, was characterized by a development based on tourism and real estate, nothing else. And the result of this quality of development simply does not bring good paying jobs and good jobs. So we as a party have as our target to overturn that. In other words, to use tourism so that through synergies, tourism, primary sector, agriculture, manufacturing, to create a model which would be closer to the Spanish and the Portuguese model, where we have a kind of outward-looking economy. We can't have 20 million tourists coming here, but very few of them actually using Greek products, and even fewer of them becoming like ambassadors for the country abroad. In other words, we need a much more integrated approach, which will involve synergies, tourism, primary sector, manufacturing. This creates a surplus of good-paying, good-quality jobs. And in all three sectors, we have a need for manpower or woman power. It's not that the market can't absorb anymore. And in the tourism sector, each summer, people are looking for qualified individuals. The same exists in manufacturing as well, and in agriculture. Now, the second strand, jobs and research. We have very, very low level of education in research and development. We have to invest in that in our universities, in our institutions of learning, so that we can create that outward-looking, export-oriented approach, because we have that capability. The other thing now is the rules and regulations that are on the... Now, in 2011, PASOK tried to introduce the digital labor card. And New Democracy voted against that. Now the New Democracy Party has reintroduced that. Does it work? It doesn't work because there's no proper system of controls on the market. Illegal work is what it is in Greece because there are no monitoring mechanisms in the country. And there is no fear of deterrence like high penalties. It's not only something that involves migrants in Greece, it involves the entire population. Furthermore, we feel very important that there is a kind of an injustice in the internal working market, particularly as concerns women and young people. Women are underpaid. We have, by far, a serious problem here. The same thing occurs with younger people. So a way to overturn the situation is a new competitive economy which would lead to stopping that brain drain which we're experiencing today, and which it hasn't come to an end yet. It's still taking place. I don't see how people who have gone abroad would return easily to Greece. With the way the labor market functions right now and with the salaries that exist in the private sector, they won't come back. And of course, women. Well, women, we're speaking about a society where we have a huge demographic issue where women, because of the poor social state that we have, are not able to balance. They're not given the opportunity to establish that proper home-work balance. And so supporting women in society, in the labor market, they confront numerous different serious problems and impediments. That's it from me. Those are my 2 cents, if you like. Numerous different questions were posed. And I'll speak through the research that we've conducted, the studies we've conducted. They will be published in the nearest future by the union. I was in charge for 2 studies on teleworking and digitalization. The digital gap as well was brought up. The very small chasm in Greece among the young people and up to 45, 50 years of age. The big problem, however, lies with to what extent, to where do we go with technology? In other words, a large section of mainland Greece and the archipelago, the island area of Greece, mainland, I speak about the northern part of the country, the alpine areas. Well, there's no network there. There's no internet in those parts of the country. So, however skilled you are with computers, IT, and working with abroad, with elements abroad, there are people who want to come back but would like to work for entities abroad. That has nothing to do with great brain gain, actually. But how can you do any of that, actually, if you don't have a network? So with regard to the unions and young people, the majority of young people, because they're working in precarious jobs, don't have anything to do with unions. They have no link whatsoever. And in the higher paid young people, there's a problem there as well. I wanted to say that in research and development, which at this point in time employs a number of university degree holders, they had a structure, a union that was established just last year. They have 30 or 40 members from elements from the extreme left. It's very difficult to really work effectively with this group. They work on roads, on Crete, in different other peripheral areas, geographically speaking. But the overwhelming majority, with the exception of platform working people, principally in platforms that involve the transport or the delivery of food, well, there is no culture of participation, of being a member of a union. And responding to Madame Bischoff, I'd like to say that for you to be able to re-engage people, the speakers, to involve people in the unions, in these movements, they have to be somehow incorporated. They have to be somehow linked to the unions. There is some sort of activity on issues of rights, rights for LGBTQI groups, or and our party and our people who are participating in all of these different issues, because we have many people active in environmental issues, in LGBTIQ plus issues. However, those organizations are moving forward, but the labor unions are really not moving forward effectively. People are interested in their rights, they're interested in all of this, but they just don't go to the unions. Only some very, very strong and effective unions, for example, the Union of Lawyers, there is a level of participation. Maybe the culture doesn't exist, maybe the knowledge doesn't exist, but people are simply not going in that direction. I hope I answered your questions.
Social Democrats are pro-European parties, and they are not blocking social initiatives on the European plan, because other parties are blocking these social initiatives which come from Europe. And I think this is also a message which is very important. And for the young people, we are the ones who are fighting very hard in the European Parliament to have a directive on minimum income, and not recommendations from the Commission, but a real directive. We are the ones who want a directive to ban unpaid traineeships, because so far all the votes we had in resolutions on to ban traineeships, the people from EPP, the Conservatives, they never voted that. And you have to push that, and you have to tell your voters that they have to look at how MEPs from Conservatives vote on social policies in the European Union. This is very important, and especially also to prevent young people to turn to the far right, because the far right, they are the ones who in the member states, they tell the people, we take care of the workers, we take care. But in the European Parliament, they always vote with the big money, with the business. The platform directive, they were against. They were against it. When it's the minimum wage directive, because collective bargaining is also very much strengthened in that one, many of them voted against it. And this is also something very important, and I think this discussion we have today is also a message to young people that national elections are also European elections, because you vote the people who represent you in Europe and who are the ministers are co-legislators, and they block social legislation, or they can push social legislation. We had a lot of advances due to the Portuguese presidency, because we had Portuguese social ministers who pushed social Europe. We have now high expectations to the Spanish presidency, where we know social Europe will be pushed. The German presidency also help pushing social Europe. So I think this is a message I want to give to you also. Convince the Greek youth that social democrats, socialists are the forces who are the defenders of social Europe. And Iratxe came up with this wonderful sentence: we are the ones who want to give a red heart to the Green Deal, a red heart to the digital and the environmental transition, because these transitions are there and they need social policies. Social policies are not outdated. Trade unions are not outdated. I entered politics when I was your age. My country, everything, we had good social policies, and people say, why do you fight for social rights? But now, after the economic crisis, austerity, after COVID, we know how important social policies are, and they are not outdated. They are very fashionable, and but we have to make them sexy and sell them to our young people. That's my message I want to give to you. Thank you.
Mark, you are speaking about what happened with the extreme right, and really it's important to do this mention. But at the same time, the extreme right are using this unhappy situation by the young people to increase their support, because they change totally the narrative, and they try to convince that the problem is not their vote. The problem is the European Union, is the institution, is the establishment, and young people are like very near sometimes to this type of populism, no? We need to do more pedagogic. Yeah. It's difficult in this time with the social media, when you have no time to do anything, everything is very quickly, but at the same time, we need to explain this type of issues. Mark, what they are voting, for example, about the minimum income, about the minimum salary, and when they are selling this message about the European Union, we have to put in front of their face and explain what is really what they are doing. Okay, if it's not more words, okay. In 10 minutes, we will continue with the next working session. We can make a break for 10 minutes, okay? Thank you, and thank you, of course, our guests for participating in this event. Thank you.